Hello friends, I have to tell you all about C60 Purple Power. Since I started using C60, which may be the most powerful antioxidant known to man, I feel amazing, and you should too. I have more energy, I sleep better, and I've lost over 30 pounds. But please go check it out for yourself. It has so many amazing benefits. Just click the link in the description or visit c60purplepower.com and use coupon code KNOWLEDGE10 to get 10% off your order plus free shipping. That's C60 Purple Power. Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight, my guest is AP Sylvia. Before I bring him on, I have to thank My Patriot Supply. They are the experts in emergency preparedness. With the unsure future we're facing and the Rona madness still ramping up again, an emergency food supply might not be a bad idea. Right now, you get $70 off a 2-week supply and $100 off a 4-week supply. They're food that stays good in storage for up to 25 years. It tastes great. Just click the link in the description or visit preparewithfkn.com to get your supply today. And please subscribe to our backup channel on lbry.com. Just in case one day you can't find us on YouTube, they decide to get rid of us. You never know. And I want to huge thanks to everyone that has made donations this month. You're all amazing. If anyone would like to make a donation, those links are in the description as well. Tonight, I want to welcome AP Sylvia. He has been a long time interested in supernatural beliefs and their origins. He has explored the essential texts of vampire folklore and has visited various vampire-related locations. He runs the blog locationsoflore.com, and his first book, Vampires of Lore, Traits and Modern Misconceptions, came out this past October. AP, welcome. How are you doing tonight?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. This is going to be very interesting. I've been a fan of vampire movies and books, but apparently our modern portrayal of vampires from the original folklore is not accurate, not historically accurate at all. And I enjoy learning new things about folklore and our historical depictions, even accounts of paranormal entities. And pop culture has shaped the depiction of the vampire, just as it has with many actual historical accounts that has changed it over the years. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, some historical places, possibly paranormal phenomena and other oddities that you write about in your blog. But first, I'd like to get started with what got you interested really in historical folklore, places, and vampires.
Sure. So I've always been interested in sort of supernatural beliefs and the paranormal ever since I was a kid. I always, read books about them and things like that, movies and TV shows. If ever there was a documentary on or something, I would certainly catch those. So I've always had sort of a general interest that's been with me since I was young. But a few years ago now, I was in New York City in Times Square, and I was at the Ripley's Believe It or Not museum that they have there. And there's a number of them around the country, and they're full of sort of interesting objects and oddities and all kinds of cool stuff. So as I was walking around there with my girlfriend, who's now my wife, we came across this one display that was of according to the label, a 19th century vampire killing kit. And so it was this antique looking box with vials and a stake and a cross and a silver bullet mold and other things. And it really just had such a great aesthetic to it. It looked so cool. And so after that trip, I was sort of thinking about that kit, and I was like, I'd like to learn a bit more about that. So I took to the internet and started reading up on these kits, and there's a number of them around at other Ripley's and at other museums and things. And I found that there was actually some controversy surrounding them. Some people maintain that they're authentic. Authentic period pieces. Other folks claim that they're actually like 20th century constructions using period pieces. So someone like took a vintage box and took some a vintage stake and kind of put them together and made this kit. And one of the arguments for that was that, oh well, these kits represent sort of our movie notions about vampires, like the Hammer horror movies and stuff like that, and don't really reflect the folklore. And so that kind of assertion really got me on this track of like, well, what did people really believe about vampires in the past? What were the actual beliefs? Because I knew there were some differences just based upon some documentaries I had seen and stuff like that. So I sort of started looking for like, well, give me a breakdown. I want someone to sort of go through the vampire trait by trait and tell me like, well, where did all these things come from? Were these real beliefs? Were these just from movies? And I couldn't really find a comprehensive list like that. And so I started digging a bit more and reading some different things, and I sort of ended up writing the book that I wanted to read.
Oh, very cool. And what about these different locations that you write about in your blog? What got you interested in these folkloric locations?
Well, I enjoy sort of I enjoy sort of like just going to sort of different places just around my area, or if I'm on vacation somewhere or something like that. Because there's often sort of cool stories or legends and stuff in sort of like just sort of offbeat places, or places you might not think to look. And so I kind of enjoy that, sort of going to a place that maybe isn't known to the general public necessarily, but is known to have sort of legends or folklore attached to it. And so I would go to those kinds of places from time to time, just even sort of around where I live. And a number of them are oriented towards vampires. They are vampire accounts took place there, let's say. So I thought it might be kind of fun to share some of the pictures that I took of them and talk about some of the folklore behind them. And so I started the blog Locations of Lore. That's kind of another outlet for myself to sort of write about things that I was interested in.
Very cool. Now, have you ever had any personal paranormal experiences or anything occur even while you visiting any of these places?
Well, nothing especially profound. I will say there was one time where I was at this mansion, and it's a place that's open to the public and they do tours and stuff like that. And we were in kind of the main hall, waiting for our tour to begin, and everyone heard this loud crash. And we look over it, and one of these kind of giant doors that were off the main hall that led to a few other rooms had closed. And sort of a number of staff members kind of scurry over to this door, and they're kind of messing with it and muscling it, and finally they get it open. And there was no one on the other side, and I just kind of assumed, well, maybe somebody bumped it, or maybe someone sort of kind of was hiding in the other room because they were embarrassed that they made a loud noise or something like that. Or maybe it was just the wind or vibration, but the doors are quite large and heavy. And I sort of just wrote it off. And after the tour, I approached the tour guide, and I asked, oh, are there any ghost stories associated to the house? And she immediately, without skipping a beat, responds, "Oh yes, Mrs. Crane, who lived there, who was the wife of Mr. Crane, who had built the place. She's still here, definitely, and she closes doors on people and locks them and stuff like that." And the minute she said that, I thought to myself, like, oh, Gee whiz, I wonder, was that door actually was that a visitor? Or you never know. Maybe it was the spectral hand of Mrs. Crane.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. You never know. So give us a basic overview of your book. What's it all about?
Sure. So the book is basically a trait by trait analysis. So every chapter it focuses on a specific trait about vampires that we associate to vampires today. So there's a trait about blood. There's a chapter about blood drinking, fangs, coffins, turning into bats, and sort of all of the things that kind of come to mind when you think of vampires, especially sort of like the Halloween vampire. And so every chapter kind of examines this trait, and I look for folkloric precedents. So if I can find actual folkloric tales that involve this, I'll share them if there's legends or beliefs or what have you. I'll talk about those in the book. If I can't find anything, then I'll try to determine, okay, well, when was this introduced? Was it a product of 19th century literature? Was it a product of movies? And so then I kind of explore when that kind of came into being as best I can.
And what kind of source material did you use for your research? And what kind of historical documents or anything like that?
Sure. So that was something that I kind of I realized as I started digging into these things. Um, you need to be careful when you start reading about sort of vampire accounts and stuff like that, because there's different legends and accounts that date back many hundreds of years, and sometimes they'll get retold in by modern authors or people writing an article on the internet or something like that. But you need to be a little careful, because sometimes what can happen, either knowingly or not, is that our kind of preconceived notions about what we expect of vampires can kind of seep into the retelling of them, and people might sort of interpret things or inject things that when you then look at an older version of the story, oh, suddenly that stuff might not be there anymore. So I tried to go back as far as I kind of could. So there were some 20th century sources that I used, but I tried to be judicious in which ones I used. I tried to pick books that were more scholarly in nature. I would look at sources from the 1800s, the 1700s, or even going back further if I could. So I basically tried to go back kind of as far as I could get, to sort of get the kind of untainted beliefs before maybe some of our modern kind of our modern kind of notions would sort of seep into maybe some of the retellings.
Now, what is one of the earliest depictions that you found of what a vampire is?
Sure. So, and I guess to a certain extent, this gets into sort of how I defined a vampire, because that kind of comes into play a little bit. But I can share a tale that dates back to the 12th century, that was occurred in Great Britain. So I like this tale, and I like sharing it because it's kind of outside the time and the place that we tend to think about vampires, right? Most people, like when you talk about vampires, you immediately think, okay, Eastern Europe, 1700s, 1800s, something like that. But so this is 12th century Great Britain. But the story, now they don't call this creature a vampire, but in many accounts that you read, they don't necessarily use the term vampire. Vampire was kind of, used in certain tales in specific places and times, but the fear that the dead could cause harm to the living and sort of preserve their own vitality in death, was a very widespread belief, regardless of kind of what the term was used or the particulars, and it changed from place to place. But so in this tale, it takes place in Anantis Castle, which is either like in northern England or maybe Scotland, and it revolves around this fellow who was, in life he was kind of a scoundrel, so he lived in this town, and he suspected that his wife was cheating on him. So he gets this scheme in his mind. He tells his wife that he's going away on a trip. He's going to be gone for a few days. And instead of leaving, he climbs up into the rafters to spy on her. And so while it's a catcher in the act. So while he's up there spying on her, he loses his footing and falls to the ground and injures himself. And so the wife goes to him, and he's like, he said, I caught you cheating, and she's like, oh no, you're not well, or whatever, and gets him into bed. And they call for the priest to come and give him the last rites. He's still kind of upset from everything, and he refuses the last rites. He says, come back tomorrow or whatever. Well, by then he's dead. He passes away in that time. So you have this fellow who was known to be kind of an evildoer in life. He died without having last rites, so he was in a state of sin. And he didn't commit suicide necessarily, but he died in kind of an unnatural way by, sort of kind of by his own actions. Now, these days, we wouldn't necessarily think of that as being like a cause for a vampire, right? There was no other vampire in play here or anything like that. But in folklore, that was a great recipe for a vampire. People who were evil in life, if they committed suicide, if they were, died in sin or whatever, there was, belief that they would come back, as a vampire, as, undead essentially. And that's what happens in this tale. He starts rising from his grave every night. He starts wandering through the streets of the town. Kind of this pack of dogs kind of follows him around. And so everyone starts staying inside for fear of being attacked by him. Now, that sort of works for a little while, but his breath ends up poisoning the air, as the story goes. And so a plague descends upon the town. So people start dying, and other people start fleeing the town. So eventually not many people are left. And the remnants of the town are gathered together one day to kind of figure out what they're going to do next. These two brothers who had lost their father to the disease, they decide that they're going to take action. While everyone else is kind of meeting, they say, you know what, we're going to go and do something because we've lost our father to this corpse, and we'll be soon to follow. So they dig up the man, they dig up his grave, and when they find him, his body is bloated. And as they're kind of digging him up, they pierce the body and blood comes out. And they say that it was as if he was filled with the blood. It was like a leech filled with the blood of many people. And the term, if you read the Latin version, they use the term sanguisuga, which translates to leech, but quite literally translates to blood sucker, sanguisuga. So they take the body, they remove the heart and rip it apart, and then they burn the corpse. And by burning the corpse, they destroy this undead menace, and the flames have this sort of almost purifying effect on the air and dispel the plague. And so the town is saved by these two brothers, as the story goes. And so that's a tale, again, from Great Britain, 12th century, but it's got all these key elements of what I deem to be kind of a vampire tale.
Yeah, that's what I want to get into, is these elements of vampire, because when you look at modern vampire tales from books and movies, from Dracula to even more modern movies like, Lost Boys and things like that, you have the most common, you have the fangs, you have that they can only come out at night, daylight will kill them, garlic, stake through their heart, all these common things about modern vampires. But when it comes to folklore, what would you say are some of the more common traits of a folkloric vampire?
Yeah, well, it's when I first started tackling the book, I realized early on that I had to figure out what, as far as I was concerned, a vampire was. Because when you start digging into these tales, there's a rich history of supernatural beliefs and mythology around the world. So when you start reading about vampires, there's lots of other creatures that often get discussed, right? Like, oh, there was this monster that lived in the woods and it drank the blood of anyone that wandered in, or something like that. And so sometimes like, oh, that's like a vampire. But for me, I wanted to kind of hone in on some key elements that I felt really represented maybe sort of the psychological roots of where vampires were coming from. So I wound up coming with three criteria that I used to say, okay, for the purposes of my book, this constitutes a vampire. So the first criteria is that the vampire is the corpse of a once living person. So it's not some kind of demon or monster or creature that was never human to begin with, right? Because there are stories like that of these entities that, would drink the blood of people or something like that, demons and whatnot, but they were never living people. They were never neighbors or something like that had passed away. So that was my first thing, that the vampire was once a person who has now died. So that kind of gets into this fear of the dead. The second thing is that the corpse is harming the living in some way. So I actually broaden it out a little bit beyond just the blood sucking, because there's lots of accounts that, it's this undead person, they are causing fear and illness and whatnot. The specifics of blood sucking may or may not be present in the story, but I feel like if you solely focus on, if they don't say blood sucking, don't talk about, that doesn't count. I feel like you lose way too much if you do that. So to me, it's like the dead are causing harm in some fashion. Again, it's this fear of the dead. And then lastly, to destroy the vampire, action has to be taken against the corpse itself. So there's a physicality to vampires. They're not like sort of these ethereal, untethered like spirits or ghosts or something like that. There's a physical root to the problem that sort of the populace is facing, and it's buried in the local cemetery. So there's kind of a focal point for people to look towards and say, this is the root of our problem. So those were the three criteria. And so with that, I kind of was able to focus on what I felt were kind of the relevant stories for my analysis. And, from there, I found I found a lot of interesting tales. I found, that some of the things that we're used to with vampires are present. Even if they are, oftentimes there's some nuance that we might have lost over time. And then other things, they're not there at all, that they just kind of, they got introduced somewhere along the line, and now they're kind of with us as if they've always been there.
Right. Let's talk about some of those nuances and differences that we see now. What are some of the traits that we don't even hear about anymore that have been lost completely?
Oh, sure. One that doesn't get referenced very often, though every now and then it does. Is well, actually, probably most people, one of their first kind of exposures to a vampire character is on Sesame Street, right? The Count Von Count, right? Who loves counting things.
Yeah.
And it's it's a fun character, and I think usually when people see the character and kind of what he does with all the counting, they just sort of assume, well, it's a play on words, it's a play on him being his title of count, and he's counting things. But funny enough, a belief that vampires would obsessively count things is actually found in folklore. Although it doesn't get used very often in movies and stuff like that. Every now and then it does come up in a movie. Usually if it does come up, they specifically mention this is true to folklore because no one's really heard of it. But there were accounts where people would take grains or seeds or what have you, and they would put it in with the grave because they believed that when the vampire would arise, it would obsessively count all of the seeds or all of the grains and stuff like that. And thus it would do that all night, and then it wouldn't go out and attack people. So that's sort of a belief that, funny enough, everyone's sort of exposed to probably when they're kids, but you probably don't think much of it, but is actually sort of an interesting aspect to folklore. One of the reasons why I assume it kind of didn't last was because it's sort of it's kind of an awkward kind of thing for the vampire to do. It does show up in an episode of the X-Files, and it's used kind of comically because they throw something, the vampire has to go over and count it all. But people, in folklore did believe that vampires had these kind of compulsions.
Now, how many of these folkloric tales, how much do you think is actual accounts of unexplained phenomenon, and how much is, just things that haven't been understood at that time period, but we understand it now because of modern science and things that we've learned over the years? How much do you think was actual, genuine, paranormal phenomenon or something unknown?
Well, when you get into the accounts that are very specific, so there were some accounts like where villages thought that they were, that they were in the grip of a vampire, and they actually got written about in newspapers and things like that. So when you look at those accounts where you get a lot of details, then as you sort of analyze it all, it becomes rather apparent that they probably were sort of misinterpreting things that we understand today that they didn't have the benefit of back then. There's in my book I talk about the work of the scholar Paul Barber, who kind of he put forward this theory that a lot of these vampire beliefs stemmed from misunderstanding of the decomposition process. It's fascinating stuff. And when people would do these exhumations, they would see things that just didn't make sense to them. Of course, when you get into other legends about people fearing, believing that they were being visited in the night by the image of someone they knew. Obviously, that kind of thing features in a lot of spiritual beliefs and things like that. So how much of that might be interpreted that way, it's hard to say, because obviously some of these things are more like they're a bit more in the midst of time kind of thing. They're kind of foggier and they're more like legends and stuff like that. But the ones where we really get a lot of good detail, the ones that say made it into newspapers or were written about in that way, you can see that in those cases it does seem that there was something was going on that was making people scared. They were interpreting things a certain way. Some people were saying they were being visited in the night by these people. You can interpret that kind of however you want. The exhumations, a lot of that seems to be able to, and what they saw seems to be able to be explained by by the sort of science of decomposition.
Now, when did this eventually, become a more widespread belief and spread beyond Europe? And what other types of accounts were there besides the ones found in Europe?
So I think, I think these beliefs surrounding sort of the fear of the dead and what the dead could do, I think they're found in various countries. And I think, beliefs kind of grow and change and kind of influence each other. I do think ultimately, though, this fear of the dead is something that's probably kind of more of like kind of psychologically embedded, I think, in humanity. So I think it's likely that it's sort of evolved and kind of came up sort of independently in a lot of different places. But I mean, in my book, I talk about there were beliefs. So you can kind of, you have sort of the Eastern European countries, but then, as you kind of, you spread out, you've got beliefs, say, Germany, Greece. Greece has a strong tradition of vampires there. They're known as the Vrikalakas. Russia, the Nordic countries. I mentioned Great Britain earlier. There were beliefs in vampire-like beings in China. I talk about one in my book, the Qiangxi, which was like an undead person who was terrorizing a village. The beliefs actually even spread over into the New World. There are accounts from New England of these vampire incidents, and those are actually some of the places that I've visited, the graves of these suspected vampires. I've visited some of those, and I talk about those in my blog. So you find them in a variety of places, a variety of forms. It's not all necessarily the same. There's a lot of kind of variation and nuance to them. But I think, getting back to my sort of three criteria, the core of it all seems to kind of be there. This fear that the dead pose or potentially pose some kind of threat to the living, and that they can sort of, preserve their life and take life away from the living. They'll make you like them, so to speak. And then, something has to be done to protect yourself.
Now, let's talk about some of the individual traits that have come along, starting with the blood drinking. When did that become more of a prevalent trait in, folkloric vampires?
Sure. Blood, sort of the connections between blood and kind of life force or vitality are really ancient, right? If you look at the classical epic there, the Odyssey, right? In that story, Odysseus at one point he goes to the gates of Hades, and he has his men dig a trench and they fill it with the blood of sheep. And suddenly all these wraiths from the underworld start coming up and approaching the trench. And he keeps them away except the ones that he wants to talk to. And those he wants to talk to, he lets them approach the trench and drink the blood. And once they consume the blood, then they can speak to him. Now, these aren't vampires, they're ghosts really, but you have this kind of connection of blood sort of imbuing life, imbuing vitality, right? So this is an ancient kind of thing. This is kind of a ancient sort of association or symbolism. A story that sort of maybe brought it to the attention of many people was in the 1720s. There was a case of Peter Plagojewicz, who died. He was a villager in this town in Serbia, and he passes away, and the villagers start thinking that he's terrorizing them in the night, and other people start dying. And some of them say, "Oh, he came to me in the night and he laid on top of me and strangled me." And so the people go to this government official, and they're like, "Look, we need to dig this guy up because this is we're in trouble if we don't." And the government official's kind of like, "Let me ask my boss. Let me ask my superiors." And the people are like, "No, we're going to do this. Otherwise, we're all just going to leave the village." So he goes, "Okay." So they go. They dig up. They dig up the body of this man, and they see these things. The condition of the corpse surprises them. It seems to them unexpected and unnatural. He seems to be very well preserved. He seems like he's got like new skin and nails. And one of the things they notice is that there's blood around his mouth. And so they see that and they go, "Oh, that's the blood that he drank from his victims," right? They didn't really mention blood drinking prior to this, right? They mentioned he was strangling people and stuff, but they see that, and then they make this connection. Now, the blood or something fluid that looks like blood can appear around the mouth as sort of a natural part of decomposition. But these people didn't know that. I think probably a lot of people today don't necessarily know that. So they took that and they were like, there's the blood drinking. So you have this interesting kind of marriage of sort of these associations of blood and life force that go back into, go back in history. And then you have this decomposition process that kind of ties it together. And this account got published in a newspaper, and it's kind of one of these well-known accounts.
That's interesting. What about fangs? When did fangs become a thing with vampires?
So that one, I always feel like I'm raining on people's parade when I talk about fangs. It's funny because they're so iconic to vampires today. Like, I always say, if you're watching a show and somebody stares menacingly at the camera and they smile and you see the two extended canines, you immediately go, "Oh, they're a vampire." Fangs actually do not feature in folklore. They don't come up. They're not mentioned. There are a couple of accounts that mention that the vampire had elongated teeth. Now, people will sometimes read that and go, "Oh, they mean fangs." It's like, well, they didn't say fangs. They could have said fangs. They could have said, the canines. They didn't. They said elongated teeth. So that would imply kind of all of their teeth, and that can be interpreted as maybe like the gums receding due to decomposition, let's say. But those references are few and far between anyway. doesn't get mentioned a lot. The elongated teeth in general doesn't get mentioned much at all. That's not that often. When fangs actually got introduced was in 19th century literature. So there was this, in the 1840s, there was this Penny Dreadful, which is like it's a serialized, fictional work. So it, as little chapters come out over the course of time, and it was very long running, and it was called Varney the Vampire. And the main character was Sir Francis Varney, who was a vampire. And in this Penny Dreadful, it mentions the vampire. It mentions the vampire's tusk-like teeth, and mentions the two incision marks on the neck. And so that's another thing that's missing from folklore. The two marks on the neck that, is always the indication that it was a vampire. That never comes up in folklore. But so it was this kind of 1840s Penny Dreadful that then it got assembled into a very long book. That's actually the first time that it's really introduced. And sort of, it then sort of stayed with literature. Probably most famously, it's incorporated into Stoker's novel Dracula, and from there, all of our movies and whatnot.
Man, can't believe it. Vampires didn't have fangs. Wow.
Yeah, it's kind of a letdown. Yeah. It's kind of a letdown.
Well, what about coffins? How much is that is accurate in folklore?
So there's that's always something that's a little bit interesting, because in the vampire movies, usually there's oftentimes like a shot of like the vampire like slowly moving the lid of the coffin over, maybe like with the kind of the hand like kind of artistically reaches around the coffin, slides it over, and it's in maybe their crypt or a dungeon or something like that, right? So did vampires reside in graves and coffins in folklore? Yes, they did. However, oftentimes they were buried, right? Like they were buried under like feet of earth. So to me, the interesting thing was more like, well, how the heck are they getting out every night? If they're covered under, multiple feet of dirt, right? They're going to like dig their way out or something. The movies, that's never a problem because they're not really buried underground. They're usually in a crypt or mausoleum or something like that. It's a bit more efficient. So in folklore, I guess I should first say, oftentimes it's not necessarily discussed in a lot of these accounts. It's basically sort of taken as somehow the vampire's doing this. And I think probably people were gripped by fear and hysteria, so they didn't necessarily care how the vampire was getting out. It must be based upon what they were seeing. There were some folkloric beliefs where the vampire never actually needed to leave the ground. In Germany, there was a belief of a vampire called a Naxurer, and it would chew in its grave. And the act of chewing, it would consume its shroud and whatnot. That was believed to cause illness and death in family members. So like those vampires didn't need to, those beliefs, they didn't need to leave. There was a book written by he was an abbot, Dom Augustin Calmet, in the 1700s, and he wrote a book talking about supernatural beliefs and kind of analyzing them, and goes into detail about vampires. He was trying to figure out, is this vampire phenomenon we're hearing about, is this legitimate, is this real, or is this not? Because he felt like, the church needed to, if it's legitimate, then it's the devil and the church needs to address it. Or if it's not real, then the church should educate people that they shouldn't be worried about this thing. So he was kind of, he speculated like, well, how is it that the vampire is leaving its grave at night? And he wondered if maybe the vampire, through the work of the devil, has the ability to change its form such that it takes on like the quality of water, so it could pass through the dirt without disturbing it. So that was kind of one of his ideas. He also wondered if maybe, maybe the vampires aren't real at all. It's the work, maybe angels or demons can make these manifestations happen. It's like an illusion. There's one really interesting tale where this vampire was tormenting people, and these monks stay up one night to like slay it. and all the monks, they're outside, they're cold, they all go to like inside to warm up, except for one monk. And when the one monk is there, then the vampire knows that that's his best chance. So he leaves his grave, and the monk chases him. And so the vampire runs back to his grave, and the account actually mentions that the ground opened up for him, and the vampire went back into the ground. The monk actually was able to like hit him with an axe, I think, as he was escaping. And then the next morning, all the monks dig up the vampire, and there's the wound from the axe. So that's kind of a fun one. And there's actually other beliefs too, where they believe that a small hole in the ground near a grave would actually be an indication that it was a vampire, because the small hole was how the vampire escaped. So in those beliefs, the vampire probably had some kind of transformative ability. So it wasn't necessarily always like a whole person. It maybe turned itself into, mist or whatnot, and was able to escape through the hole and then form itself again. So there was a number of different kind of takes on how it got out of its grave, out of its coffin. Which I think are interesting, because it's something that in fiction is never really a problem or not really addressed that much. But in folklore, people kind of had to tackle this sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, it is very interesting. Now, in the movies and books, when it comes to killing the vampire, we have the garlic, stake through the heart, sunlight. I don't know if I'm missing anything, chopping off a head.
So many ways. Yeah.
So let's talk about some of those. Where does that originate? Let's start with the garlic and then get to the sunlight and the stake through the heart.
Sure. So garlic is actually very present in folklore. That's well established. People would they would take garlic, and they might actually like rub garlic around like entrances to their homes, doors, and keyholes and whatnot. There absolutely was a belief that garlic would keep vampires away. The rationale for that is kind of interesting. Garlic has kind of, ever since ancient times, there was a lot of associations to garlic. It was thought to be sort of do different things, curative, or keep vicious animals away and stuff like that. So it's possible that kind of just on kind of the laundry list of things garlic could do, vampires sort of made its way onto that list. But one interpretation I thought was interesting was that garlic has a very pungent aroma, so it can be used to mask the smells of other things. Right now, vampires were thought to smell very badly because they're a corpse. So the smell of the garlic would overpower the smell of the vampire. And then I guess through sort of magical means, the garlic by keeping the smell away, you actually kept the vampire itself away, which is kind of an interesting interpretation. But yeah, the garlic was certainly present in these folklore and these kinds of beliefs.
What about the daylight killing vampires?
Oh yeah. So daylight is actually that is not present in folklore, which probably surprises people, because that's pretty well established in movies and stuff like that. That the vampire, if they go out in the daylight, they get they turn to dust, or what, they get burned and they turn to dust. That's and even if it is even if there's a show where that doesn't happen to them, you usually have to like explain that doesn't happen to them, because it's sort of the expectation that an audience would have. In folklore, there are some accounts that, first of all, vampires were normally nocturnal in these stories and accounts and all that. They were attacking people at night. Now, in some of these beliefs, it is said that sometimes the vampire was seen during the day. They saw it walking around or something like that. So in those beliefs, the vampire wasn't limited to the nighttime, that the vampire could be out and about during the day if it wanted to be. There are a number of other tales where they kind of follow a pattern where someone is being chased by a vampire at night, and the vampire's just about to get them, and then the rooster crows, and at this point in the tale, the vampire falls lifeless to the ground. Now, reading that, you might think, oh, well, there's the sunlight destroying the vampire. But when you read a number of these tales, some of them make it quite clear that the vampire wasn't killed or destroyed or anything at sunrise. It just became lifeless again. And the assumption being that the next evening it was going to come back to life again. There's one tale where this vampire actually he meets up with this soldier, encounters this vampire, and the vampire actually kind of explains to him that, like, well, to actually kill me, because the vampire's in his hubris, because he was planning on killing the soldier, he tells the soldier, oh, to actually kill me, you need to, like, do X, Y, and Z. And but then the vampire attacks the soldier is able to fend him off long enough that the daylight comes, the vampire's lifeless, and then they can actually do what the vampire said. So at best in folklore, a vampire was lifeless during the day, but certainly not killed or destroyed or anything like that. And when you look at the beliefs, it kind of makes sense, right? Because, if you think of these beliefs coming out of people being afraid or desperate, right? There's some kind of illness or disease that's descended upon their community. They're looking for answers. They're looking for a reason and something to take action against. So they dig up this corpse because they feel like this corpse is the cause of this problem. And think about it. They open up the coffin. They see this body that to them is exhibiting the signs of a vampire. Leaving it out in the sun for 10 minutes probably wasn't going to provide the catharsis that they were looking for as a community. They needed to feel like they did something. And so just having the sunlight on it for a little while probably wouldn't cut it. So when sunlight actually comes into play here is there was a movie in the 1920s, a black and white silent film called Nosferatu. It's a German film. Most people have probably seen some of the imagery from it at very least. The main vampire in it, he's bald with pointy ears, and he's got these like pointy,
very classic image.
Yes, very very classic, very sort of classic. And the imagery gets used a lot in that movie. It's fun. The story around the movie is kind of interesting. The production company Prana Film wanted to do a Dracula movie, but they didn't have the rights to Dracula. So to avoid getting sued, they change a bunch of details. So they change character names and some of the plot points and stuff like that. The main vampire in it is named Count Orlok. And so in this movie, they have this book that explains this vampire killing ritual where someone has to willingly give themselves over to the vampire for the night. So the vampire will feed on them all night until dawn. At that point, when the sun rises, the vampire will be destroyed. And that's what happens in the movie. Orlok feeds on this woman all night long. As he's leaving, he goes in front of a window, and the sun peeks up over the horizon, and he does this kind of dramatic shift, and holds his arm, his hand up, in this sort of like sort of tragic way, and then the next frame is smoke rising from the ground. So that's actually the first time that sunlight kills a vampire. It's interesting though, because depending on how you want to interpret the movie, it might not have been the sunlight itself that killed the vampire. It might have actually been the whole ritual, which included a willing sacrifice. So potentially our notion of sunlight killing the vampire might have actually been from a slight misinterpretation of the film. But I mentioned that the film, they changed a bunch of details to avoid getting sued. But that didn't work. Bram Stoker's widow sues the company Prana Film, and the judge rules that they are in violation and that all copies of the film are to be destroyed. But thankfully, some copies survived that purge, and so we still have the movie today.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, before we move away from vampire folklore and get into some other things on your blog, first I want to go over the final, killing of a vampire, the stake through the heart. Give us a little history on that, and then I have one more thing that I want to talk about vampires with you with.
Sure. So a stake through the heart is certainly present in folklore. It's used in a variety of tales. It comes up that they stake the vampire as to either kill it or as part of kind of a succession of things they're doing to try to kill it. But there's a lot more nuance in these tales than kind of we're used to with stakes. So usually with in movies or something like that, it's like a wooden stake, through the heart, and that kind of almost magically kills the vampire, right? Like the vampire, the vampire might have gotten shot a bunch of times and it's fine, and then like it kind of it's lunging towards the hero, and the hero grabs the stake, and they stake the vampire in the heart, and the vampire's dead, something like that. Or maybe they kind of sneak up on the vampire while it's lying in its coffin, and they nail it in. The interesting thing in folklore, first of all, is that there were beliefs that the type of wood used was important. So you couldn't just use, so in some of these places, you couldn't just use any wood. You had to use a specific type of wood. So depending on the place, it might be hawthorn, whitethorn, oak. Usually one of the explanations I ran across for this is that depending on the place, those woods were associated, they had religious connotations, essentially. They were associated to the crucifixion. So probably using that wood maybe kind of imbued the stake with some kind of religious or spiritual power. But the other thing that's interesting is that in some of the accounts, the wording that's used is that they talk about staking the vampire, pinning it to the ground is kind of a phrase that's used in some of these tales. And that's interesting because then the stake kind of takes on this very kind of practical role of that you were actually staking the vampire through the body into the ground so that it couldn't sit up anymore. It was stuck to the ground by virtue of the stake. It was pinned in there the way you sort of, if you're putting up a tent, you stake its ends to the ground. So there's sort of maybe sort of spirit, sort of a religious or spiritual aspect to it. There's a very sort of practically minded aspect of it, of like you're physically preventing this thing from getting up. And then, of course, the destruction, going through the heart, the destruction of the heart, there were other beliefs around destroying the heart in some fashion. The heart, of course, being associated with life, being associated with blood and something like that. That also probably adds to the power of that, is that you're destroying the heart in the process. So staking certainly comes up. Usually, though, in these kinds of tales, the ultimate way to get rid of the vampire was by burning the body. So that would usually, so in some accounts, they try a few different things, or they'll do this, they'll do that, and then they burn the body. And by burning the body, you've destroyed the thing that was harming you. I talk about the physicality of vampires. Well, it's not there anymore, right? So there's nothing to rise up from the grave anymore. You've literally turned it to ashes. So that often was kind of the final resort when dealing with vampires, is that, all right, we'll burn it, and so there's nothing left of it, and now there's nothing to harm us.
Oh, that's very interesting. Now, before we move on to other things that you've written about in your blog, I'd like to get your thoughts on what you would consider modern vampirism, people that practice these, I guess, spiritual practices, you could call them, people that even drink people's blood. They have these conspiracy theories of how elites have this black market blood trade or something going on. All these different stories having to do with types of vampirism, I guess. What are your thoughts on what's going on modern day with that?
Yeah, well, I certainly have run across some information about, there are sort of communities of people who, some folks, they just like the vampire aesthetic, right? So they just sort of dress in a certain way, and decorate their houses in a certain fashion or something like that. They just sort of, they like the look of that and presenting that way. I am aware that there are some folks out there that believe that they do need to consume small amounts of blood from willing participants in order to kind of feel normal, that kind of thing. And then I know there are other groups of people who believe that they're like psychic vampires, so they need to kind of absorb psychic energy from other people. So I have run across some information about that. Ultimately, that wasn't the focus of my book. I'm more concerned with sort of the history and the legends and the folklore. So I haven't researched that much. I haven't reached out to those people and talked to them. And that would probably be what you'd really want to do to really find out more about it. I will also say that, there are, in some remote places, I read, there was one account I read about, because it made the international news, from the 2000s, in a remote village in Romania, where people did still believe in the folkloric vampire, and someone in the community passed away, and people believed that that they were being they were ill because of him. They were sort of being attacked by him, and then they took action against the corpse. And this was in the 2000s. So the actual folkloric belief does still kind of exist out there, and maybe some small pockets. It is still kind of culturally relevant to certain groups.
Very good. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your blog, Locations of Lore. I was going over some of the articles you wrote, and you wrote one about sorcery at the Tower of London. And the Tower of London has a very intriguing history to begin with, but this story was very interesting, I thought. Could you tell us a little bit about that particular story, the sorcery at the Tower of London?
Sure. Yeah. So the Tower, the Tower of London is, it's done a lot of things in its day. It was, originally constructed for kind of defense and sort of imposing kind of the royal, the royal authority over the populace. It was like a mint. The mint was there at one point. Famously, it was used to house prisoners. It was a jail. There have been some executions on the site. There was a menagerie there with animals. It's a really cool place to visit if anyone's ever in London. So I wanted to write about it, but it was kind of a daunting task, because I was like, there's like so much history to the Tower of London. And it's like, I've heard, I've heard many times about the ravens that are there. They keep ravens on site at the tower, and there was this belief that there was a king who wanted to get rid of who was asked to get rid of the ravens, because they were I think they were getting in the way of the Royal Observatory there. But then the king was informed that there was this prophecy that if the ravens ever left the tower would fall, and so would the kingdom. So now that's like, it was decreed that there would always be ravens there. So if you go to the tower, you will see like ravens around. And they have cages for them and stuff, but the ravens, they actually just let them like wander around, which was kind of funny. Like I was like standing on some stairs, and like there was a raven just right on the railing, like right near me. I was like, whoa, like, hey, they're big too. They're pretty cool.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, so and there's different ghost stories there. People who have seen the ghosts of people who were executed and whatnot. But so I was kind of like, oh geez, like how do I tackle the Tower of London? So when I walked into one of the rooms there in the Salt Tower, potentially they kept salt there at one point because it was valuable. There was this, there were carvings in the wall from prisoners. A lot of the carvings, they were done by like Jesuit priests when they were being persecuted. But there was this one carving was very ornate, this very intricate carving of like it was like an astrological chart with symbols and a sphere and all this stuff. And I was like, what is this thing? This thing's awesome. I was like, this is so cool. And so when I was looking at it, I took some pictures of it, and it was basically what happened was there was this fellow back in the 16th century named Hugh Draper, and he was arrested for sorcery. So he was accused of sorcery, that he was kind of bewitching someone who was well-to-do. He was an innkeeper, Hugh Draper, and he gets thrown in the tower. Apparently when he was arrested, he told them that he used to be interested in magic. He used to practice it, but had burned his books, and so was no longer practicing magic, and had never taken any magical action against the people. So essentially denying the accusations. But he was imprisoned there, and while he was there, he carved this very intricate kind of astrological chart into the wall. And it's still there today. We're not sure what happened to him. One of the accounts of the person who ran the jail said that he was ill at the time. So some hypothesize that the position of the chart might have been that he was having trouble standing, so he was sitting on the ground to do it. But it might have just been more comfortable because he had a lot of time on his hands, because it's imagine carving this thing day in, day out. But it was, so that was just an interesting story that I had never really been exposed to when I've sort of watched things about the tower or read articles. So I tried to focus in on something that maybe people hadn't heard of that much. And I share, like, the picture I took of it, along with various other pictures of the tower. And I also talk about some of the other ghost stories there, and I talk about the ravens and stuff like that too. But I kind of wanted to take a different angle on the tower, just because, I mean, books had been written on this thing. So I was like, oh, what am I going to do on a blog post?
Yeah, very cool. And I also saw your article about the crystal skull at the British Museum. That's another one of those things that, is it a real authentic item, artifact, or is it just a recreation of something? It is rather interesting item. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the crystal skulls and the one you wrote about at the British Museum.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously there's a lot of sort of legend around the crystal skull and stuff, like skulls around it. There's a number of them, and some people believe that they contain they're like computers in a way, like that contain sort of mystical knowledge and stuff like that that's kind of embedded in the crystals and whatnot. And there's a number of kind of key skulls around. I think probably maybe the most famous one, or one that kind of brought the notion of crystal skulls to prominence, was like the Mitchell Hedges skull. That's the one that I'm probably mispronouncing this now. That had that was like a two-piece skull that had like the jaw and the head. But the British Museum skull, you probably know more about the skulls than I do. I just ran across one at the British Museum and have a general understanding. I am in no way an expert on crystal skulls, so apologies to all the crystal skull experts who are like rolling their eyes at me right now.
Oh no, I'm no expert either.
I'm the vampire guy. I don't know.
Yeah, I do find it fascinating, though. It is.
Yeah. And so this one at the British Museum, it was believed to be kind of ancient in origin, but then subsequently, I think, they did some studies on it, and those studies determined that it was, I think, made during like the 1800s or something like that, because they thought they had used modern tooling with it. I just think they're just sort of, what these, I love the look of them. I love the aesthetic of them. I like the mystique around the crystal skulls. So when I was at the British Museum, I was like, oh, I gotta find, because I knew they had a skull there. So I'm like, I gotta check this thing out and take a picture of it and share a little bit about it on the blog. And it was really cool. It was cool to see. I'm glad they have it on exhibit. They have it because there's just interest in it. Whatever you believe about it, if you believe that there's mystical origins to some of the skulls, or whether you just think they're really cool pieces of art, it was nice to see one.
Right, definitely. And there was one more thing that I want to talk about from your blog, the Spirits Machine in Massachusetts. Yeah, tell us about. I've never heard of that before. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that was interesting. So yeah, the Spirits Machine at High Rock. So
High
this
Rock,
was yeah, that one I kind of I got a kick out of this story. So it basically revolves around this guy, John Murray Spear, who was he was a minister, but then he kind of transitioned to like to spiritualism and the spiritualist movement in the 1800s. And he believed that he was in contact with spirits, these kind of wise spirits, like people like Thomas Jefferson and stuff like that were talking to him, and he thought he was in communication with these people who had kind of this sort of secret knowledge and stuff. And he believed that he was being instructed by the spirits to build a machine that would essentially it was called the new motive power. It would generate it would be an unlimited source of energy. It would generate energy sort of forever, like perpetual motion. And so he sort of, and he did not have apparently a background in engineering or anything like that, but he thought the spirits were telling him what to do. So he put together this machine at High Rock. It was a great expense at the time, and he also believed that it was going to be sort of imbued with like a living spirit that would kind of give it life. So like this woman believed that she was sort of going into this labor, like, but she was giving birth to the spirit. She wasn't really pregnant, but like she believed that she was sort of she was carrying the spirit inside of her, and they kind of had this kind of ceremony where she kind of gave birth to the spirit, and then it would go into the machine and animate the machine, and this was going to be like this great gift to humanity, essentially. So this all happens, and the machine kind of it was supposed to like represent a human, but it wasn't supposed to look like a human. But it had kind of like these arms and these spheres that hung from it and stuff like that. And so apparently when it was all done, like he thought it moved, and some other people thought it had moved, and like, oh, it's alive, right? And so people would sit with it and try to imbue it with energy and stuff. But ultimately, people kind of they ultimately realized that like it's not really moving. Like the things that are dangling from it might move from vibration and whatnot, but the actual mechanism that was actually really supposed to turn and generate the power, it wasn't doing anything. So eventually he leaves. He takes the machine with him, I think, to New York State. And according to Spear, an angry mob at some point comes along and destroys it. And I think they were using all kinds of this very like flowery language to describe this thing. And when it first was done, like, it was this new messiah and stuff like that. So people apparently destroy it. Although some folks wonder, was Spear just kind of like done with this thing and just said it was destroyed just to kind of put an end to the whole endeavor. But it was a very interesting kind of tale, and it kind of showed sort of how spiritual beliefs can motivate people to do things. And it seems that he truly believed in what he was doing and thought he was going to be helping humanity, but it obviously didn't materialize. But it was a very kind of interesting anecdote in sort of the spiritual beliefs and how they were changing in the 1800s, where you were kind of getting this like merger of spirituality and science, because the spirits were informing on how to build a machine to generate. So you could see kind of the popular views, how they were sort of changing at that time too. So it embodies that quite nicely.
Right. Well, AP, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I have one more question for you. With everything that's happening with the coronavirus lockdowns, there isn't much production of movies. We do have a lot more podcasts. We have book opportunities. What do you think is going to happen with vampire lore in the future? Do you think it's going to be around to stay? Do you think it's going to keep evolving, or do you think it may just fade away eventually?
I think it's going to stay with us. The thing that I found most interesting about vampires is their adaptability. Vampires have been changing over the course of time to meet the needs of people, whatever they might be. Whether you're talking in, say, the 1700s, where they needed some rationale for why some kind of malady or disease had befallen them. Then you shift to the 1800s in literature, where vampires kind of take on this kind of suave and sophisticated demeanor, where now they're kind of infiltrating parties in high society, and that resonated with Victorian readers. And nowadays, you often see this focus on the immortality of vampires. A lot of shows kind of really dwell on that fact. And I think that resonates with people today, because, we don't need to explain we don't need to explain diseases and stuff like that anymore with vampires, but science hasn't yet conquered aging and death. So the notion of this being that can circumvent that, I think, resonates with people. And I think what also resonates with people is that by circumventing it, the vampire is also cursed. So maybe there's kind of a lesson in there that nature shouldn't be subverted. So I think vampires will continue to change and adapt as sort of new authors take the vampire and kind of, alter them in ways that will reflect with, audiences and readers of the future.
Very cool. And your website is Places of Lore. Your book,
Locationsoflore.com.
locationsoflore.com, and your book is Vampires of Lore. What's the best place that people can pick that up if they're interested?
Sure. You can find it really on all kind of the major online booksellers, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can, I think there was, last time I checked, some Barnes and Noble actually had it in stock in like the New York and LA areas. If you want to get it from your local bookseller, you can probably go there and ask, and they can probably get it in for you.
Very cool. AP, thank you again so much for coming on. Very interesting information. Love to have you back on sometime in the future.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.